Since we're kind of talking about, being taken, what do you think that our future selves would have, or why would they have interest in taking us? Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm Emmett,
I'm Joe.
and we're the UFO Bros, and we're here with Dr. Michael Masters. And for those of you who don't know who he is a professor of biological anthropology, specializing in human evolution anatomy, archeology, and biomedicine. Welcome, Dr. Michael Masters. How are you?
Doing great. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Great. Yeah, we're really super excited. And for those of you
Yo,
uh, listening and watching, we're going to talk about time travel today and the implications of that. And if there's anybody out there that we should be chatting with, it's Dr. Masters here. So for those of you also who aren't super familiar, we have his book, Unidentified Flying Objects, and it is an in-depth work. It's a masterpiece, really, which
I
goes
don't
great
know
with your
about
last
that.
name. Um, I can barely write a paragraph, so to me, it's a masterpiece. I'll tell you that
All
much.
right.
So, I wanted to get into with you a little bit about your theory and what kind of got you into thinking that what we're witnessing in the skies and all these sort of phenomena, how they potentially pertain to possible time travelers.
Yeah, I mean, it it's a lot to unpack there, I guess. But for me, it was something that I thought about starting at a young age. I had kind of this little vision, I guess you could say. I've come to recognize it as a conscious, precognizant memory, a future memory, if you will. And
That's
they're pretty
interesting.
common. Yeah, I just finished reading Eric Wargo's book, Time Loops, and it's entirely about that. And it's actually pretty common. In fact, I'm pretty sure everybody has them, to be honest. It's just some people pay attention more, or maybe they're more vivid. I don't know what it is, but I don't think that it's anything super anomalous, to be honest. But during this moment, I was 8 or 9 years old, and I looked up and saw Whitley Strieber's book cover, and it was very inspirational, as it was for thousands, if not millions, of people. And yeah, I kind of wondered if they could be us. They share a lot of the same features, and they seem to have characteristics that would indicate that they come from a more evolved grade of hominin. So in my primitive child brain, I pictured kind of an early hominin, a modern human, and then this archetypal gray alien, all in this kind of linear sequence, and it just made sense, honestly. And since then, becoming a I mean, where to start? I guess I started out in physics and astronomy as an undergrad, and then switched to biological anthropology, mostly because I wanted to pursue this question in the context of these beings, and to see whether there was something there, whether we do actually look like them or they look like us, and what that might mean in the context of phylogeny and long-term evolutionary trends.
So, just want to pick up on something you just talked about, which was sort of a precognitive vision, so to speak. I think I've had those, and I've never really talked about this, but I'll give you an example. Joe and I did a show with Demi Lovato called Unidentified with Demi Lovato on Peacock. And 2 years prior to a friend of mine, I texted her out of the blue and I said, one day I'm going to work with Demi Lovato. I just saw
Huh.
it in my head. I didn't know in which sort of way, but I just had this feeling that I was going to meet Demi and that it was going to be something special. Would that be kind of an example, or do you think that that's like a happenstance, or is that kind of what you're talking about?
Well, no, I mean, it's always good to be cognizant of potential correlations that, a law of large numbers would dictate that enough things happen. We're bound to work with somebody in some context and happen to text about it ahead of that in certain cases, but you can whittle away a lot of those probabilities, and especially with that text, that being very specific to one individual and a relatively short time frame leading up to that. For me, it's mostly been dream precognition. I've had it my entire life, and I'll see an event before it happens, sometimes a couple weeks, a month, sometimes 20, 30 years.
Wow.
It's just it's in there, and then you live the moment and you remember the dream, and those 2 points are always connected in time, and it's very similar to sort of the way we conceptualize time travel too, because it's essentially just cognitive time travel. I've only had conscious precognition about 5 times in my life, and it sounds like what yours was is an example of that, where it's a waking state precognition. And that's, it's interesting. Those are much more rare for me. I don't know if they are for other people, but it makes sense when you're in a dream state. If consciousness is unbound by time, then you can look at forward memories in the same way you can past memories during waking life. And so yeah, it's always kind of mind excuse me, it's always kind of mind blowing when it happens in a waking state where you sense something that's about to happen. But through dreams, I don't know, it seems more natural, I guess, just because the dream mindscape is so abstract to start with. But within that, you can see reality through it. You start to be able to recognize future memories and distinguish them from the nonsense of a normal dream.
Wow, that just blew my mind. You're talking about if you can look into the past, then why can't you look into the future? If you're saying time and space are correlated. Um,
Yeah, and in the block universe model, which is the most dominant model to explain space and time in the context of physics and philosophy and others who have studied this, the future is just as real as the past. And it's there for your future self to look back on. Our future is somebody else's past. Somebody else's future is our past. So it's all there in block time in the block universe. And if it's already there and it's real, and your consciousness enters a timeless state beyond our physical bodies, then yeah, you can see those things and remember them.
um, let's talk about the singularity because I wonder a lot of times with these vehicles in the sky, these UAP, if they're the result of an eventual possible singularity that enables us in a way to travel through time, like, I don't know, an Uber of the future, so to speak, that it helps us to understand how it is to move and navigate through time. What are your thoughts on that? Or do you think that we're leading up to a place where we'll build time machines?
Well, yeah, I think it's more the latter. Singularity means different things in different contexts, and in AI, it refers to something different than, in the context of black holes, for instance, where you have a singularity that's all mass and energy in the universe all compact together. And I don't think we're gonna use anything like that. I mean, it's fun to
Okay.
think about what happens inside a wormhole or inside of a black hole where time reverses, like can't escape it. So it sort of innately goes into a timeless reality, where backward time has also been hypothesized for what takes place in a black hole singularity, really at the event horizon, essentially. But I don't think that's the case, because if you look at a number of these instances of close encounters, the craft itself seems to have the ability to manipulate time and space. And in my most recent book that came out in June of last year, the extratempestrial model, I look at a number of different case studies that seem to indicate exactly that time moves differently. It can be sped up or slowed down in and around this craft, and what Jim Peniston referred to as a sphere of influence around it. So that seems to indicate that they have the ability to manipulate space time, or engineer the space time metric, as Hal Puthoff refers to it. And that would seem to indicate that that this thing then is separated from time space in many ways. They can go forward, backward. I think it helps explain the transmedium aspects of it. If they're essentially taking themselves out of this reality in the way that we perceive it in linear time, then they could easily move between water and air, because they may not be perceiving them the same way. I think it helps explain the G forces, the insane accelerations and decelerations that people always describe. I think that's more about how we're observing that craft, and they're probably slowing things down outside of the ship, but inside of it, even though it seems like a tremendous 10,000 G acceleration, they probably don't feel anything, or possibly 1 or 2 Gs at the most. So I think it's really just an aspect of the frame of reference, the temporal frame of reference within that sphere of influence around the craft and then outside of it. And they seem to be disconnected in a way. You have people that get closer. Corporal Armando Valdez in Chile crossed into the sphere of influence, disappeared from his men, came out 15 minutes later as they perceived it, but 5 days had passed for him. His watch even read 5 days in the future, and that's the only thing watches do is read time. So it seems to indicate that either he was with them and they brought him back in time to 15 minutes after he disappeared, or time moved differently in the period that he was within that certain radius of the craft. So there could be a couple of things going on there, but case after case, you see the same thing. Travis Walton described a study where they saw that the trees in and around the place where he was taken up into the ship after it sent a shock through his body, all the trees in that vicinity grew at like 20 or 30 times faster than the trees just outside of them. And
Heard of
previously
that.
they
Yeah.
were all the same age. So, so many things seem to indicate that it's the craft itself that is the actual time machine.
Since we're kind of talking about, being taken, um, what do you think that our future selves would have, or why would they have interest in taking us to study us? Or do you think that maybe in the future there's some sort of genetic problem that they need to solve? What are your
Well,
thoughts on
I
that?
mean, there's no way to know for sure, obviously. There's
Of
probably very
course.
few people that do, if anybody does. But from my research, it seems to be both. I mean, obviously, as an anthropologist whose job it is to research and study the hominin past and figure out our cultural life ways and our physiological form and how those change over time, if I had access to that technology, it would make my job infinitely easier across the anthropological spectrum and all the different subfields. People study geology, ecology, the evolution of any life form, really. You would instantly have the ability to go back and study them as far back in time as your craft could take you. I don't think they're able to go back to the time of dinosaurs or anything like that. The upper limit's probably 50, 60, 70,000 years tops. But I think
Where did
there's
you
a
come up with
research
that number,
component.
if you don't mind me asking? Why would they not be able to go back to, say, the dinosaur times?
Well, I think it has to do with speed, to be honest. What I think happens in relation to going back super far in the past, you've probably seen a lot of these videos where the craft's hovering, then it takes off super
Yeah, it
fast, straight
zips
up on.
away.
Yeah, and I was on a show called The Proof Is Out There on the History Channel, and they brought me on to talk about this and how I think that's an aspect of what they're doing, because in order to, at least in the physics we understand now, and there's probably a lot more going on, the fact that they're able to manipulate space-time sitting completely still, as I was just talking about, certain cases, indicates there's already something going on with the way space-time is manipulated in proximity to these craft. But in my primitive view of this, what I think is happening is that in order to travel back into the distant past, they need to reorient light cones sideways. So a light cone is when, say, you turn on a flashlight, a beam comes out, because nothing can go faster than the speed of light. That means that everything, every possible outcome moving from past to future has to be within that cone that's formed as that light radiates out. And within that are individual world lines as we travel through time and space in this seemingly linear fashion. So in order to physically travel back into the past, you have to tilt those light cones over, which means that physically you're still going forward in time, but because your world cone has been reoriented or tilted on its side, now it allows for you to move into the past. In a local reference frame, you're going forward. In a global reference frame, you're now moving into the global past. However, just tilting that light cone doesn't necessarily project you into the past. I think that's where the speed comes into it, where when you see it take off at that tremendous speed, I think it takes speed to travel forward in time using special relativity, time dilation, which makes time shrink essentially, as does space. So I think they're using that speed with the light cones reoriented toward the past to actually move deeper into that past. And so I think there's probably a speed limit associated with that, as there is with anything, because again of the speed of light. You start to increase your mass, you start to increase the amount of energy needed to propel you faster. And anything with a mass bigger than a photon, which is everything, So I do think there are limitations, upper limitations to how far back in time we can go.
To somebody who's not a scientist, I mean, that actually was a great explanation of kind of how that could work, and the fact that there, speed being a limitation. Um,
Yeah,
let me
if
go.
that's a factor, I mean, it seems to make sense. And the way you go into the future is by going fast relative to the speed of light. So in my, primitive way of viewing this, to go deeper into the past, you go fast. Well, your light cones are angled toward the past, but I guess we'll find out if that's accurate or not at some point. If they are actually us, that is.
Do you think that they're responsible for the cattle mutilations that have been making national news, especially recently and since, of course, the 70s? Or do you think that that's something completely?
Have there been recent ones? I
Well,
hadn't heard
yeah, there
about
was
that.
at Skinwalker Ranch, as an example, they've had several issues with, cows being mutilated in a way that didn't make any sense at all whatsoever. There's no tracks, there's no seemingly evidence of people or other animals being near, you know, uh,
Yeah.
the cow. I'm just curious to know if that, because if we're looking at this from time travel perspective as opposed to necessarily space alien perspective, I guess I just want to know what would be the interest uh, in cattle mutilations, or if that might be something that's not quite, part of, I guess, your theory, or involved in it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. And the hard part with all of this, like you can see kind of what they're doing. You can look at their morphology based on these reports and consistency across reports. And then you can kind of get a sense of consistency in behaviors and what they're doing. But then the why behind it, the intent becomes infinitely harder to explain. It's the same thing in archaeology. We can see all of the cultural material remains of past groups, but then figuring out the meaning behind them, the symbolism behind them, why they made that thing becomes a lot harder. But with that said, it does appear to be completely related.
Okay.
Anecdotally, I've met people who grew up on ranches. They grew up on farms. I've reached out to the agricultural board here in Montana and talked to them about it. And they happen in association with UFOs and lights. Most of the time it's at night, but people see these lights out over their pasture field, and they'll go out the next day, and a certain number of cows have been subjected to this practice. And it's always the same thing. The eyes are removed, the anus is removed, the blood is drained without any blood around. Oftentimes the tongue is cut out. So yeah, you
It's like
start to see
mucosal
patterns.
membranes seems to be what they remove.
Yeah, yeah, and the blood I think has some import as well. I think it may even be, I mean, I'm just speculating here, but a lot of people have been on these large triangular craft describe the incubation chambers, sort of these exogenesis chambers, where
Oh,
oftentimes they're
geez.
in a pink fluid, and you got to wonder if maybe the blood helps nourish that developing fetus. Obviously, I have no way of knowing, but I'm just trying to think of why, yeah, why those body parts, because it's always the same. And I don't know. I mean, maybe there's something more to it. Maybe it's trying to test for some environmental aspect. Because obviously that's been a big focus in a number of these cases, especially since we started to fire off nukes and
Yeah.
use weapons and
Yeah.
test weapons. So there seems to be more interaction, more focus, more sort of investigation of ecological change, you could argue. Another case in my recent book, they're coming and picking up grasshoppers. They're studying grasshoppers in this one region of South Dakota and Southwest Montana over a long period of time, 50, 60 years, according to this individual's account. So, again,
Interesting.
why grasshoppers? That seems to indicate that it's some aspect of ecological testing, but yeah, I don't know. They're not taking the meat. It doesn't seem to be a consumption thing. Um, I don't know. That's a good question, but I do think they're related just because people see those craft in association with mutilation so often.
Isn't it with them? Don't they have like their diet is more like they can thrive on fruits and vegetables or these like these little pellets, these little pellets that they put in their mouth and they dissolve. Have you heard of
Yeah, I
that?
mean, I've seen some circumstantial stuff that, yeah, seems to relate to a sort of hyper condensed form of nutrition. Um, but yeah, I don't know. Like some of these other accounts where people have been given a tour of the ship with the more human looking individuals who I argue come from a more proximate point in our future, maybe even the next 100, 200 years, they're shown
Wow.
kitchens. So why do you need a kitchen if you're just eating little pellets of food? I think that might be something more associated with our more distant evolutionary descendants, like the Greys, for instance. Or maybe, even get to the point where some of these gray looking individuals are human AI hybrids, and that's just kind of their power source. Or it's like Bender from Futurama, where they just drink fists of whiskey and that fuels them up. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, I do wonder why they have kitchens if they are eating that stuff. But again, that could be a difference in the temporal ancestry when they're coming back from, more than anything else.
What comes to mind is the story of the alien pancakes. Um, we'll have to put some pictures up, but there was, have you heard of this?
Yeah, I haven't
The
heard of that one.
Oh, you
Uh-uh.
have it. I'll have to, unfortunately, off the top of my head, I don't know the name of the gentleman, but or I think it was a few decades ago, where he uh talks about this saucer that landed on his farm, and he was able to see inside the craft, and he said it looked like they were making small little pancakes.
Hmm.
As a matter of fact, he claims that they gave him one, which, by the way, is still somewhere. And they had, yeah, this actual
That's cool.
physical pancake,
Yeah.
and it had some testing, and it had some very high nutrient value, very low sodium. They talk about how maybe sodium has, something to do, or low sodium is how they consume things. I just always thought that that was super interesting. So when you talk about kitchens, the first thing I think of is the pancake UFO incident,
Yeah.
um, which is, I think, a really great story, which
Yeah.
could be,
And
physical evidence. If only I could get my hands on that pancake, I'll tell
yeah,
you.
I mean, and think about it too in the context of ease of food. You have a batter made up that's highly nutritious and whatever it is you need. Throw it on before you go out, and we have I
Yeah.
don't know if y'all are skiers or snowboarders, but we take pocket bacon with us. You cook it up in the morning, fill a baggie full of it, and
I
stick it
love
in your
bacon.
pocket, and you eat pocket bacon all afternoon, so you don't have to stop and get food at the lodge or anything. So it seems
Yeah.
like
That
pancakes would
reminds
be
me.
great for that.
So I was going to say, that reminds me of Huel and Soylent, which are two companies that are producing essentially all the nutrients in food in just one serving. It's like a
Yeah.
drink or a powder that you mix with water, and that's like your food. And a lot of
Yeah,
people,
and if you're
to get
going
get
out.
it in quickly and get it absorbed quickly.
Right, right. And if you're going out in the field and you don't have time, you're not going to take a cooler with you with a couple beers and some sandwiches and stuff. You're going to take whatever you can in the most efficient way possible. So, yeah, if that's in the form of a little granola bar or a pancake or a little ball of energy in whatever form, it seems efficient to me, and
Well, it
maybe
makes
even the way of the
sense.
future.
Yeah, well, we're doing it now. So if you fast forward
Yeah.
100, 200 years, I'm sure there's going to be more of that sort of thing as humans become busier and we learn more about how food, affects our bodies. And, it seems as though we're already kind of refining food down into the most easiest way to absorb with the highest nutritional value possible. So it would
Yeah.
make sense that maybe the aliens do have pancakes.
And one of
That
the
is,
biggest correlates with cancers is processed food. If you can take out the stuff you don't need and just make it the simple thing that gives you what you need without all of the excess, then yeah, maybe it's a healthy. It sounds boring as shit though, to be
oh
honest.
yeah, it sure
Just
does. I mean, I
eating
love my Arby's,
nasty,
Joe. Joe
yeah,
and Arby's.
just
Oh,
eating nasty like graham pancakes every day sounds horrible, but maybe they're not. They get back to the ship and they have a big
Last
feast.
a lot.
Maybe that's just functional because they're out working and just need to pack whatever's easy and fast. But I don't know. That human future sounds like garbage if that's the only thing we're eating.
I guess so. I guess maybe
right?
part of our evolution will be to get hamburgers out of the way. I don't know. Um, speaking of kind of, evolution of the human body, in your book, you give some really great examples, and we'll show those, where and just off the top of my head, you talked about, breeding dogs and how much they've changed just in a few hundred years, of selective breeding. And hold on one second, you still there?
Yeah, I just lost
Yes.
my earbud. My other one was
Okay.
still. Are we talking to Joe? Because he's been chunking this whole time.
What's that?
Is Joe? Were you talking to me or Joe?
Oh, I was talking to you, and it looks
Oh
like we
yeah.
only have,
No, my earbud fell out, but I
for
still
whatever
had the other
reason,
one in. I could hear you.
for some reason, it's only giving me 10 minutes left of this recording. I don't know why. We might have to stop and then redo another meeting if we have time.
Yeah,
But
that's fine. You can just cut them together and post.
yeah, that's what I'm gonna do. Um, Joe, did you have any questions at this point, by the way?
Your alien autopsy. Now that was the biggest thing growing up. That was the number one thing that I canceled everything for to watch on TV. Was that real?
No, it was in a strict sense you would call it fake, but I
It was
I
a
recently
recreation, right?
as a recreation, that's what I call it. Yeah. And there is a lot of evidence to support that. I've spoken with a lot of the people involved. In fact, I had a 2-hour conversation with the executive producer of the alien autopsy video just a month or
Wow.
two ago, actually. And
Is that Bob Kivat?
yeah, Kvyat, yeah.
Kiviat,
And
yeah.
he said the same thing, that it was definitely based on something. And that was the only argument I was making in my book. I got a lot of shit from people that didn't bother to actually read what I was saying. And were like, "Oh, you talked about the alien autopsy. It's fake. Everything you say is wrong now." There's a lot of those people in the UFO community, as it turns out. But what I was saying is that based on the details that went into making that recreation, to me, it seemed clear that it was based on something. Otherwise,
Oh yeah.
you wouldn't know to do those things in that way to make something that's so consistent with a hominin form and that's so consistent with these other alien forms. And the other point I was making is if you're trying to recreate an alien autopsy, why make it look human at all? Why make it
Right.
have the same physical characteristics that we have in the exact same proportions, but at a slightly more evolved state than what we see today based on long-term trends in our own evolutionary anatomy. So yeah, I mean, if you read between the lines, you can see that it seemingly was based on something, and the footage was just too messed up to be able to do anything with, but they had enough that they could see based on the original autopsy what was happening and the form of the alien enough that they could recreate it. And it was a decent recreation for being what, like the early 90s or something. Is that when they
Yeah.
made that?
I think it was like 96. Oh no, wait. I think it was 96.
Not you.
Or
Yeah, I
was
think
it?
it was. No, it was earlier than that because I was in. No, I think it was. Yeah, I think it was 96 because I just started undergrad around then. But yeah, I mean, Ray Santilli allegedly had some found footage of this that actually took place, and then it was all based on that. But yeah, the actual one that we all saw was definitely a recreation.
The story behind that, I believe, is they actually had some authentic footage that somehow became damaged in a fire or something like that. And so that they had to recreate what it was that they saw in the footage. I believe that's the story behind the Santilli footage and why we have, the alien autopsy that we do. But
Right. The
Joe,
problem
I want,
was, just a second, the problem was that they weren't forthright about that at first, and they led people
right.
to believe that this was the actual original footage. And only later did it come out that it was a recreation. So it was a little disingenuous at first. It doesn't mean we should just throw all of it out with the bathwater, but we should definitely recognize that there was some Hollywood fabrication going on, or misleading people, I guess.
I think it's a great point that why make it human looking? They could have made it look like something from Independence Day or aliens. They could have make it. It's not a
Yeah.
scary looking being. It looks
No, it's a
just
human. It looks like a
quite
human.
literally an evolved human.
Hmm.
Which brings me to the next question, which Joe and I always love to ask this question. Joe, do you want to ask him about Skinny Bob so I can cut that in so it sounds like you're talking?
Shut up. You're a dickhead.
I know.
There's kids that are in here bugging me.
Sibling rivalry.
Oh, all the time, constantly. This is.
I'm recording.
Will you stop moving
No.
so damn much? Your internet is
your internet's
shithole.
better than his too, so I could see why you're doing most of the dialogue.
Yeah, it's my eyes as fast as I can get up here.
Okay, just don't move your face too much. Just try to stay still and ask him about Skinny Bob.
Lock it in.
Yeah.
So I'm huge enthusiast of Skinny Bob. Skinny Bob's my number one fellow. What do you think about Skinny Bob? The way that people are portraying him, like you see it on the internet, the picture, the reel, where it shows the old time 40s reel and it shows him doing a pan down on him. Do you believe that what a gray would look like from the future, or would that be something that was probably done on CGI? If you ever seen it.
Yeah, I have. I've watched that video a lot because I've wondered the same thing, and it's hard because it is so easy to make stuff these days, but that also is kind of old too. I don't know when it first came out, but it isn't
2008.
2008. All right, so we had some CGI capabilities back then, but to me, it's kind of the same thing as the alien autopsy. Everything about the morphology of this individual not only matches what we would expect to see in our more distant human future. Now we're talking about probably tens of thousands of years to actually achieve that level of cranial globularity and mid and lower facial retraction, and the ears seemingly atrophy over time. But then the postcranial morphology, the body as they pan down, is also very consistent and seems to display what's known as paedomorphosis, where they retain these juvenilized traits. And that's described so often in these close encounters where they're talking about little kids out there, little diminutive humans,
Right.
that exhibit juvenilized traits, characteristic of adolescence. And that's a trend, a very dominant trend in hominin evolution. And when I talked about the dogs in my first book, we see that with the little pedo pups that we make. We make these little dogs that are meant to stay puppies. They still grow up. They have an ontological trajectory, but in adulthood, they retain the juvenilized traits of what we make them keep. We do this on purpose. And then they have a big round head, little tiny face. You compare that to a Doberman Pinscher or a Collie, where it has a big long face and a little tiny sloping forehead. So yeah, I mean, the physical traits are consistent. The postcranial characteristics are consistent. From my understanding, there's some sort of telepathic communication going on, which is also
Yeah.
consistent.
I was going to ask you, do you think that would be why, as an example, the grays are described without ears or just little tiny ear holes? Is that because potentially as we move forward, telepathy and how we figure, however that works, like, because before we were talking about precognition, I don't know if that lies in the same path as telepathy or not, but would that be why a lot of the grays are described earless?
I don't think so per se. In my first book, I argued that we may have to evolve that form of communication simply because as our mid and lower faces retract, what happened is that we flared out our descending ramus of our mandible. So our jaws got wider. We have a V-shaped dental arcade compared to chimpanzees and gorillas that have a U shape because they have enough space for everything in there. Their faces project outward. As our faces shrunk back, we still have to breathe, we still have to chew food and speak, which is very important. But even that might be imposed upon by our retracting facial anatomy if the brain does continue to move anteriorly and expand mediolaterally. So yeah, I thought that was maybe an aspect of it, but I'm kind of walking that back these days. I think it could be a factor. Maybe they go hand in hand, but I don't think one necessarily causes the other. what I've come around to more recently is that it's an aspect of our evolving consciousness, that it's a way of energetically connecting with other individuals. And I think it's going to happen long before we get to the point that we even become these quintessential gray aliens. I think it's really just an aspect of the development of mind and the expansion of consciousness, because it's really just a connection of this thing that exists almost as a sender and receiver, an antenna of sorts. But yeah, I was just saying that I do think, I looked at initially with telepathy in my first book, the question of whether it's brain to brain interaction, there's some sort of third party technological medium, because we can already do that with, rats and things like that.
Well, like
Um,
Neuralink is supposed to be able to do that.
yeah,
Elon Musk's
exactly.
Neuralink.
Exactly. But I don't think that's even going to be required, honestly. And this is sort of the conclusion I came to in that section of the book, is that they they seem to be able to communicate in this way with people that don't have anything implanted in their minds.
Oh
And that,
yeah,
among other things, seems to indicate that it's just an aspect of our consciousness, and that we can link our consciousness in this ways, and sometimes with multiple people at the same time. It's not just one individual talking to another. It's more of a hive mind thing that's happening, where you can have multiple people in your mind at the same time in sort of the shared space. And it's not just words, it's whole ideas, it's concepts, it's little packets of information that move freely, sending and receiving, among people who don't have any sort of third party device, a mechanical device. So I think it's an aspect of our evolving consciousness, and I think a part of that is also an evolution of empathy and an understanding of others, and sort of this energetic connection that they have with other beings. And I feel like we're all kind of moving toward that very slowly. And if you just look back in history, it wasn't that long that you had people buying and selling and enslaving other human beings, and
right.
forcing them to live apart from each other. And we look back on that with disgust, at least the majority of us do, and rightly should. But it really wasn't that long ago. And I think it's an indication of sort of where we're going, and the concept of not just empathy, but the shared consciousness. If you stop seeing ego, if you destroy ego altogether and start seeing yourself as one collective whole, and I think that's an aspect of their form of communication too, then those arbitrarily contrived boundaries that we use to construct the other also disappear. And I think that's kind of where we're going, and they seem to exhibit characteristics indicative of that.
Wow, that's mind blowing. I think that makes a lot of sense too. I wanted to move on to what you think in terms of, if is there any cases or stories or anything that is an iota of proof in any sort of way, or are we just looking at like anecdotal evidence? I mean, the case you're making is absolutely clear to me and convincing enough to really consider the fact that maybe we are visiting ourselves. But have you heard of anything in particular regarding what's going on maybe in a lab somewhere, or any sort of new understanding of physics that you could share with the audience?
Well, in the context of proof, that's an easy answer, no, because we
Right.
don't ever prove anything. All we can do is develop working models that seem to have the most support, the most evidence. That's also problematic in the UFO realm, because evidence is more or less non-existent. Like you mentioned, we have anecdotal accounts, and if we look at enough of those, you can tease things out of them, but it's still not, testing in strict quantitative terms. And we don't necessarily need that. I feel fortunate that I was raised in the anthropological field, because we don't use that for the most part. We can't experiment
Interesting.
on other humans. So
Right.
we still develop hypotheses, and we still test those hypotheses just like any other field. And it's not just qualitative, we do quantitative research too. Not that there's anything wrong with qualitative research, you can learn a lot that way as well. But in the context of collecting data, we call it observational research. And I think that's what we're forced to do with this, because you're not going to have a lab setting where you can experiment in the same way that you can with regard to, certain physical forces, or any question that exists in our physical reality in this time and in this place. So for my last book, the extra tempestura model, I used what's known as an abductive approach, where you look at as much as you can, gather all of the information together. And I looked at case studies across 5 different continents over a 90-year period and just try to find patterns among those and develop what's called inference to the best explanation, which is what an abductive approach is. And in doing so, you can start to make some informed guesses about who they are, what or where they're coming from, why they're doing the things they do based on patterns across these eyewitness accounts of their behavior. But yeah, as far as like a smoking gun,
Yeah.
strict, identifiable, undeniable evidence, it's going to be a long time before that exists, and probably won't exist until they show up and say who they are and what they're doing and why.
So like the vehicles that are witnessed, like we talked about, zipping away, being able to, you know, navigate sea and air, if it is us now, which I question, have we had any, significant advances in physics and technology that is being utilized right now, but probably under lock and key? Or are we looking at the technology hundreds and hundreds of years out, which is, why we have this idea of, future time travelers? Because if we're doing it now, wouldn't that necessarily mean that we could time travel now? If that's what's being seen in the skies is our own advanced technology. What are your kind of thoughts on, where we might be now technologically, and if that accounts to what we're seeing in the skies and under the sea?
Well, yes and no. I think in the context of our own evolution of technology, I don't think what we're seeing now or throughout the recent historic or prehistoric past is anything developed now per se. Um, it's just been happening too long with the same types of craft. But as far as can it be happening now with us involved, coming from the future, absolutely. Well, once that time machine exists, you have time travel as far back as that time machine can go. And you can have future events dictating past events. You can have a future cause and a past effect simply because time and space don't work in a linear fashion any longer in the block universe in the presence of a time machine. So yeah, the things we're seeing now that are taking place, I think, are originally from the future. But at what point they started integrating with us or will integrate with us to the extent that people from our time period are also using these craft in similar ways for similar purposes, that could be around the corner or already happening, like you said, behind closed doors. So, and there's a number of cases that suggest that that is what's going on. That people, abductees, describe being taken to a moon base on the dark side of the moon, or in caverns, sort of bunker-like places in caves, elaborate ones, not just a nasty cave with mildew all over the place, but very nice, well-established bases that exist underground or in a mountain somewhere. So, and I think it helps explain the crypto-terrestrial, ultra-terrestrial thing too, where you can have people from the future hybridizing. It's like the main thing that's described is the extraction of gametes and these hybrids that are formed, hybridizing with individuals across so many different time periods that you have the spectrum of individuals that could be plunked down in whatever time to do whatever it is you wanted. So you have boots on the ground now, and they look exactly like the people from that time, and they can move about us and still use their telepathic, clairvoyant abilities, but to achieve an end that we don't yet understand. But they could blend in perfectly simply because they have the ability to do that and seemingly are doing that based on all these descriptions of hybrid individuals who look very similar to one another, indicating that they were a part of the same stock or the same group of sperm and egg. Travis Walton described that. A number of abductees described seeing something like that.
Is there a case in particular that really, because we've talked about Travis Walton, and we talked about some other cases, but is there one in particular that you think is most credible or aligns with this time travel theory the most?
Um, I mean, really, that was a hard thing in picking case studies for this last book, is I didn't want to just pick ones that scream time travel. You need to have a broad representation of things that are happening, and also include those that go against the grain, that maybe don't conform to that idea. And the Betty and Barty Hill case is certainly one of those. It's been thrown around as this example of clear space travel. They're interstellar travelers because they showed her a star map. So it's important to include those too. But I think yeah, I mean, the Travis Walton, the Terry Lovelace cases, Amy Rylance, I think, is one of the best examples from Australia, not just because she had a good time. She claims to have been hanging out with a man, a human man, as she called him, with all the same body proportions. But because of the way it transpired, she was on this ship, she claims, between 5 and 7 days, but she was returned 790 kilometers away from where she was taken, but only about 60 to 90 minutes after her friend Petra saw her being taken through this window and into a UFO. So it indicates that the craft can fly very fast, to get 800 kilometers away in only 60 to 90 minutes. But also, if her account is accurate, and there were 3 different jurisdictions involved in this, 2 different ones from when she was taken, where she was taken, and then another in, I believe it was Gundia or McKay. I forget which one was the start and end point. But she went to the hospital. All of the police from these 3 different jurisdictions had her sign an oath that said she could be criminally prosecuted if she was lying. The doctors found that her stomach was empty, she was dehydrated, and she had about 5 days worth of body hair growth, and claims that she hates being hairy. So all of those things, if you take them together, indicates that she was with a human man on a UFO, a future human, one could argue, and that craft has the capability of time traveling. If she was there with them for 5 to 7 days, but brought back an hour and a half after she was taken, it indicates they brought her back close to that time period, probably because her husband was freaking out and her friend was freaking out. So it indicates that there's a care, not just for that individual. She said she, wasn't scared at all and even had fun. And it demonstrates care for the people that are freaking out about their friend and or wife being gone. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting case for a number of reasons, and it's very indicative of time travel.
Yeah, and that sort of um, you know, care and compassion seems to be um for the most part pretty consistent, except for when you take into account stories of people having things inserted in them, or needles in their eyes, or fetuses being taken from their body. And some people, though, which I wonder, why is it that some people are, that's terrifying, frankly, to be observed in that way. Why do you think that there's different types of people, that maybe some are less empathetic, and some that are just down to business, gonna stick this needle in your eye, put this up your butt, you know what I'm saying? So are we looking at um different types of travelers?
I think in looking at that situation, we need to recognize that it's not just different types of travelers, but also different types of people having these experiences. Clearly, there's ontological shock for pretty much everyone early on, and people, based on the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Free study, people are innately freaked out about this and scared. But with repeated contact, and especially with the more human looking forms, not just gray like, but actual humans, 85% report a positive or benign experience. So, and then that number goes up even more with repeated contact. So I think it's about the people being taken. And also a correlation I've found, again, looking at patterns, is that in my last book, I found that people who seem to be more disturbed by it, or who aren't able to grasp that reality as well, that's
Mm,
when you see more of those screen memories and the UFO apathy and the UFO amnesia, where they kind of
mm,
shut them down or don't allow them to have access to those conscious memories. But people who have a great time, like Amy Rylance, for instance, are allowed to remember everything. Why wouldn't they be, if everything that happened to them was fine and wasn't disturbing or freaked them out or made them scared? So I think we have to focus on the individuals, the research subjects themselves. But yeah, I also, it seems that there's almost a disconnect too. And we can see this with modern humans today. It's become illegal to do scientific research on great apes in 29 developed countries. And that's a pretty recent thing. We've gotten to the point where we see ourselves in them enough that we say, all right, we're drawing a line here. We'll still, do things to macaques and other lower primates, but the higher primates are off limit. We drew a stark line in the sand there. And so we could kind of maybe extrapolate that into the future, where people that are closer to us in time see more of themselves in us, and we have more shared humanity that's easily identifiable. Whereas you get into these short grays and tall grays, they're probably from a more distant point in our future where they see less of that in us, and we just seem like extremely primitive research subjects in the same way that we look at baboons and macaques and rats and mice and lower animals in general that we do all kinds of horrible things to. So yeah, I think it's both. There's a spectrum there. And the farther we get in time away from these individuals, it seems natural that they, even if they did have a highly developed sense of empathy, that they still have a job to do and maybe aren't as good even at
right.
connecting with us to try to minimize or mitigate those effects. I'm giving a talk in Cincinnati, Ohio in August about this exact thing, about not just the whole it's the MUFON International Symposium, but the whole question is
Oh yeah.
friend versus foe. And I don't think we can really talk about that without origins and intent. So I kind of look at this question in the context of extraterrestrials, extraterrestrials, ultra terrestrials, all of these different forms, but then also that ethical question, because absolutely we have to talk about touching people in their no squares or sticking things up their
Ooh.
butts. Like, yeah, that's an important
You hear
aspect
that,
of
Joe?
this.
Sorry, go ahead.
So we need to focus on that too. We can't just, dismiss the arguably ostentatious human rights violations that are happening, but
Right.
also recognize that the ends maybe justify the means. And a lot of people that are subjected to these even horrific things, forced pregnancies, extracting of fetuses, the case of Jerry, which I highlight, John Mack is one of John Mack's patients. She came to grips with it and even said that she feels honored to be a part of this thing that, is bigger than her, bigger than any of us. There's some higher purpose to it, and she feels honored to be a part of that, even though she's been subjected to arguably horrific acts since she was
Right.
13 years old.
I know that Travis Walton, from what I understand, his encounter was terrifying, but at some point he had the revelation, excuse me, at some point he had the realization that they might have been fixing him due
Yeah.
to a heart condition. So I wonder if maybe
Well, they
the
shocked the
initial,
hell out of his heart. Yeah, they zapped him with an electromagnetic discharge that he believes was accidental, and that they then sort of went into emergency mode to save his life because they stopped his heart.
so why is your focus in, well, that's probably not a fair question because I didn't read your last book, so I'm not entirely certain if you cover the extraterrestrial hypothesis, but why lean into the time travel hypothesis as opposed to the extraterrestrial hypothesis?
Well, I mean, it seems to make the most sense. Just as far as my arc is concerned, from a very early age, it was apparent that they look like us. And that was kind of my starting point. And, honestly, with that in the back of my mind, going through undergrad, graduate school, the specific focus on the evolution of craniofacial anatomy in the hominin lineage, nothing seemed to indicate that that wasn't the case, or Nothing presented itself that indicated that it shouldn't be looked at in the context of long-term evolutionary trends. So there's that side of it. The technology, the craft also seems to have characteristics. We have this expression that form follows function, and it seems to have a form consistent with the function of manipulating space-time. So, it's not just us, but it's also these machines. But then beyond that, if we kind of separate that from the extraterrestrial question, it's not technically a hypothesis because it can't be tested, but this extraterrestrial model, there's a number of problems related to, well, as Paul Hynek points out, how would they find us and why would they care? With 100 billion stars and potentially planets in our galaxy alone, how would they find this one tiny rock that we're on in a relatively nondescript solar system?
Nukes.
And why would they care?
Nukes.
What about them, though? Because even if we're sending out radiation at the speed that that's traveling, it's only reaching a pretty proximate area around this planet.
Well, I guess that the idea being, and again, I'm not a rocket surgeon, so I can't get into depth, but just on my basic understanding that the nuclear tests that we've done might somehow be causing damage in other dimensions or places in time, whatnot. And so that was the first thing that came to mind, is if there's any reason why to visit us, maybe it has to do with our nuclear capabilities.
Right. Well, if you're talking about a disruption to some sort of alternate universe or reality, that's a different question than the extraterrestrial question.
Right.
Because
Right.
what we're talking about there is other planets in the same timeline, in the same universe. And yeah, they might be able to pick up on some discharge, or, we were sending radio signals out into space in the 1970s. Carl Sagan oversaw that project. And so, I mean, we're definitely announcing our presence, whether we should or not. But even those signals traveling outward are going at the speed of light. So they can only go, what would that be, like 50, 60 light years? No, not 50 or 60 light years, but in that period of time, 50 or 60 years, the speed of light is moving out. So they would have to be within a certain radius of Earth to be able to even identify us. And then again, why would they come here? Why would they not introduce themselves? Why would they pick us up in secrecy, do all of these studies, tuck us back into bed? Why would they look so much like us? Why would they be able to have sex with us? How could they breathe our air? How could they communicate in our languages? There's just all of these questions related to this extraterrestrial idea that just don't seem to make a lot of sense. And there's extra assumptions associated with that you have beings that evolve on another planet with a different atmosphere, different distance from their sun, different chemical structure, possibly they're silicone based, maybe they don't have DNA in the same way that we do. There's all these other factors that come into play. So without those assumptions, we can sort of whittle it back, shave with Occam's razor, if you will. We know we're here. We know humans are on this planet, and we know we've had a long evolutionary history on this planet in which our morphological form has changed, our technology has changed. So if we just whittle it down to the simplest answer, most parsimonious explanation, it would be that it's an aspect of us through time, rather than being beings from a different planet that had a very different evolutionary trajectory than what we saw here.
Wow, those are questions that I never thought to ask myself. Yeah. You're right.
Thought about those questions.
Do you want to go into, Joe, do you want to go into, because I don't know how much more time we have on the recording, but I want to get into, do you want me to just ask, or do you want to ask? I just want to know his thoughts on Bob Lazar and the technology he describes.
You just answered your own question.
Okay, so you want me to ask?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I
All
think
right.
he's saying you asked your own question by asking him
if he wants to ask the question. Well, I'm trying to give him an opportunity to be a part of, Joe really is kind of, he chills.
He's the pretty face, man. You do the talking. Well, he's the one that all the ladies are looking at.
Yeah, and he can have all the ladies too, by the way. He can have them all. So Bob Lazar, his accounting, accounting. Bob Lazar talks about this sort of technology that he worked on, back engineering a craft. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that story, and if that craft potentially might even, be described as a time machine.
Well, I mean, I have to plead ignorance on some level, because I'm familiar with who Bob Lazar is, and you can't be a part of this community without coming across certain things about him. But to be honest, I've never really gone in depth about his claims or what specifically he saw. I think I saw he worked at some S4 base, part of Area
Correct.
51,
Yeah.
maybe.
Through EG&G.
Yeah,
He
and
was hired
claims
through
to
EG.
have been reverse engineering a craft. But as
10
far as the
minutes.
specifics of that, I honestly I don't have much I can offer. I know a lot of other people have looked into it way more than I have, but I mean, I
He
wouldn't
talked
doubt
about,
that even if it's not Bob Lazar, there are people out there who have interacted with these things and have worked on these programs. I have met people that have, very valid credentials who have been involved in these programs for a very long time, and I believe them, so I believe they exist. I just can't speak to Bob Lazar specifically.
Bob Lazar, one of the things that he talks about is how this craft had certain gravity amplifiers that would be able to pinpoint a time and space and sort of, create or shorten the distance between space and time using gravity amplifiers. But since we can't really expand on that, I think I'll use this time to sort of wrap up our interview. I could talk to you all day, man. I have so many more questions for you. But
Yeah, I love talking about this stuff too. It's
yeah,
I
you're so
wouldn't
well
be doing it if I
spoken. It's
didn't.
almost like you've talked about it before.
Well,
Yeah,
I mean, it's not even it's literally my job is to explain things to people. That's my profession as a professor is to describe things in ways that 101 students can understand and 500
right.
level students can understand. So that's just what we do, not just me, but all of us. It's our job.
Joe, you want to thank him for being on the show?
Yes, I want to thank you, Mr. Michael Masters, Professor. I
Thank you,
appreciate
Joe. It's been a pleasure looking at you throughout this interview.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, it wasn't a pleasure for me. I don't really care.
Pleasure.
Well, I enjoyed it for both of us.
Thank you, everybody, for listening. I'm Emmett.
I'm Joe.
And I'm
we're
Mike.
the UFO.
I'm just kidding.
We're the UFO Bros.
I just wanted you have to do it a third time.
Let's do that. You could be the UFO Bros. Well, all three of us are
An
UFO
honorary?
Bros.
Oh,
For
an
sure.
honorary UFO bro. I mean, who knows? Maybe we all share some alien DNA in there somewhere. Maybe
Probably.
we are bros. We're alien.
I love
bros.
it. And for the people
No,
listening,
I'm just kidding. Y'all could have your ending. I just wanted to jump in there because it looked fun.
Actually, I like this ending. I like this ending just as it is. I think it's fantastic, but we're going to do it one more time. Actually, I want you to say, I'll say I'm Emmett, Joe, and then I'm Michael, and we're the UFO Bros. I think that'll be great.
All right, let's do it.
All right. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody, for listening to Dr. Michael Masters. I'm Emmett.
I'm Joe.
And I'm Mike.
And we're the UFO Bros.
UFO Bros.
UFO Bros.
Yeah.